All right, all right, all right. We've got lots of things to get to and to talk about this morning. It is a live Thursday, as always, lively Thursday, and the Burning Platform is our chance to catch up on the big stories of the week, talk about all the important issues that are going to affect your life. And Pumi has already got a notebook out. She's working uh, tirelessly in the background. She's no doubt got questions and all kinds of research to bring to bear. I want to welcome our first guest to the Burning Platform this morning, and I'm thrilled to have her on for the first time. Jasmine Opperman is a qualified risk analyst, holds a master's degree in history at the University of Johannesburg, so we're going to get on like a house on fire. During her tenure as provincial head of the Eastern Cape, she engaged in senior government liaison, inclusive of premiers, MECs, and ministers. She was also commissioned as a senior trainer in the Intelligence Academy, focusing on analysis, operational analysis, counterterrorism, low-intensity conflict, and intelligence management within a constitutional democracy. Since then, she's compiled weekly and monthly insights and forecasts on extremism and political violence in Southern Africa. Very, very valuable contribution to our knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground. And there's a lot of extremism that we need to be aware of. In sub-Saharan Africa, we know that this is a very real problem. So, Jasmine, it's good to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Morning,
can you hear us?
Morning, Pumi. Pumi, just in terms, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Go ahead.
We hear you perfectly.
Pumi, in terms of your fantasy, I agree with 2 rooms. The one must be a library, no open floor. I want to be left alone in a world of books. That's all I want to do.
Very good. Very good. I noticed, Jasmine, I noticed also that you had your cigarette out just now. Feel free to smoke during this show. I grew up in a house with both parents who smoke. I'm sad to say that in the media, we see too few people having a cigarette every now and then. I think it would calm people down and they would be much more valuable to us if they just had a ciggy every now and then, instead of being bullied everywhere they went just for smoking.
You know, Gareth, we're talking serious stuff, but I maintain that the most successful policy ever by the current government has been the smoking policy, because smokers obliged. We're actually very kind people.
Yes. And I, as a non-smoker, tried to stand up for you guys, and you left me at the front of the battle and disappeared off into your little caves and dwellings and houses, and left me to try and fight on my own for something I didn't even do. So I give up on smoking. I'm not going to defend you guys anymore. I see that they're trying to propose another bill as we speak against the people who vape, but we'll leave that for another day. So let's just get into it. Jasmine, there's a lot to talk about. Let's start off with what your primary concern is at the moment, and what you're often asked to comment on and do analysis of. How much religious and political extremism do we have in Southern Africa, and where are the major threats coming from? Because we don't talk very much about terrorism. You know, we had a guy in here the other day who was telling us about Pagad and how that all went down in the 90s and the early 2000s. That's more of a gangsterism thing in some ways, but terrorism in South Africa is something which seems an arm's length away. Is that true, or are we living in this cloud cuckoo land where we think we're immune to the stuff that's happening in the rest of Africa? We know about Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. What is our state of play?
The state of play in South Africa, and I've always maintained that if we talk terrorism, we must look beyond the act of actual violence, is the presence of various extremist groups that is exploiting organized criminal networks for terror funding. And here might be a bit controversial, but let's call it for what it is. If one looks at Hamas, has received funding from South African soil. Now, many people argue Hamas is not a terror organization. It's an irrelevant question for me in the current climate that is happening. But in South Africa, we are definitely seeing a presence, even those that went to the caliphate in Syria and Iraq and returned, because the conviction to that ideology goes beyond committing an act of violence. It's supporting. In Southern Africa, Mozambique is the key focus and has been keeping me busy now since 2015-16, with the Islamic State opening the door and in the region confronted for the first time the violent face of an extremist group that is using a local insurgency. Hence, South Africa was grey listed. That was part of the reason, is that money laundering and terror financing is taking place. And yes, we might have the policies at play, but it is not being implemented, or we don't see enough successful prosecution, which is a fair argument because the court cases simply fall flat. The recent case at the Mall of Africa with Abadiga being taken by the special force in the so-called exercise, so coincidental, at the same place at the same time. And up until today, we don't know where he is, although I'm convinced that he was taken by the Americans. But that is just merely a hypothesis. I do not have the facts.
One of the things that we have heard a lot about, and it is something that keeps rearing its head, speaking of funding terror organizations, is as we see the network of spaza shops in rural areas and townships increasingly becoming foreign owned, and most of those foreigners either coming from Pakistan or coming from Somalia, areas that are funnels to kind of terrorist organizations and operations. And the fact that all of this money is possibly being channeled back there, and that South Africa is being used as a money laundering hub because of the sophisticated banking network that we have, and because of the laxness of our security forces and our law enforcement agencies. And that's why we got downgraded.
Jasmine, to Pumi's point, what you're saying is very, very serious. Do our government take it seriously? Because they're equivocating on the whole situation in the Middle East at the moment. Well, not even equivocating. They've stated very plainly on which side they are. And clearly, they are not particularly concerned, or we would have seen some arrests and we would have seen the criminal justice system be brought to bear here. What is the scale of South Africa's either financing, cozying up to, or giving succor to terrorists in this country? What's the scale of that? Do we have any idea?
Has she lost a connection?
Jasmine, can you hear us? There must be a hell of a delay. Not sure. Seems like she's live. Jasmine, can you hear us? Okay.
Yeah, I think
Just
we've
gone
lost
off
Jasmine. Look, and when we do get her
back,
and when we do get her back, one of the other things that I want to talk, and over the past couple of weeks, we have had people coming into the show and talking to us about the places between where the policy and where the policy is supposed to be hitting the road in terms of implementation, and where it's fallen apart. Just talking about the story with Pagat and what's happened and how that was systematically stripped out of the police force. What I would also want to check in on with Janice when she comes back on. Jasmine, when she comes back on the line.
I'm apologizing
Not a problem.
for that.
Did you hear the last question?
Did you hear my last question?
Yes,
and
I am back.
Okay, let's hear your response.
I apologize. Gareth, can you just repeat the last bit? I will respond to Pumi now.
So just the scale of all of this, because
Pumi,
it's evident. It's evident
careful.
that. Sorry. I'll repeat at the end. You go ahead.
Refer to foreigners coming from Pakistan, coming from Kenya. There are 3 countries to which.
I think her line is letting her down.
I'm sorry, Gareth. We're looking at Kenya, we're looking at DRC, and we're looking at Somalia. Those are the 3 primary destinations that receives terror funding. But we must be careful when we refer to foreigners being present in South Africa. I mean, most of these foreigners do not support these extremist groups. And that we have to be careful that we don't categorize them. I mean, the main person involved in terror financing for the Islamic State, owns businesses in Johannesburg. And I'm not going to mention names due to legal implications. A very prominent person that is born and bred in South Africa. So we have to be careful that we don't put a blanket over these foreign communities. Then secondly, Pumi, we have a sophisticated banking system, but the terror funding sidesteps the official banking lines. We are talking about pay points. We are talking about money transfers. It's easy as to go on a website of a terror group. There's a donation button that you click and you transfer money without an indication that it's support for a terror group, but for a charity organization. Terror funding is extremely problematic if you don't have cooperation from other intelligence services. Because if you have the transfer, has that money ended up in the hands of extremist groups? There you need the cooperation. And hence we see a persistent struggle in finalizing court cases around terror funding.
Sounds extremely complicated. What is the scale of this thing? That was my question earlier. How big is it? What's the amount of money we're talking about that is transferred between all the various people who may be participating in this and these organizations? Or do we just have to thumbsuck and guess?
Gareth, can I be honest with you? It will be nothing more than a guess, because most of these transfers are not being recorded. Most of these transfers that go through is not being done by the actual. There's no identification of the people involved. And then the destination of those that receive the money is also not always known to our local authorities and to us as analysts. But if I look at the scale of organized crime, if you look at the recent drug busts that has taken place, which is a small amount, if you talk about an organized criminal economy, that is 3-4 times bigger than our GDP. We can just work backwards and then ask how much of this ends up in the hand of terror groups. And that is where we stuck with. Gareth, I cannot give you an amount because I will be then super guessing. But if you look at Al-Shabaab in Somalia, one of the financially best aligned terror groups on the Africa continent. If you look at the Islam, and remember Al-Shabaab is AQ aligned, Islamic State has got now realigned its financing. The main affiliates gets 40%. Islamic State in Mozambique gets 20%, being distributed in a formal, structured manner. These terror groups are, I want to call it, functioning like international companies with their own goals and objectives.
And I mean, northern Mozambique, it's not even controversial to say that much of northern Mozambique is outside of the control of the Mozambican government and is pretty much being run by these terrorists.
And I think,
yes, I must. The difference has come. Gareth, can I respond? I'm sorry, the line is not always that clear. But Gareth, if we talk Cabo Delgado, with the Rwanda deployment and with the Samam deployment, Makumia, I'm not going into all these names,